We begin each week with words of gathering to draw ourselves into this space. And I am delighted to invite together CTS student Tariq Abdul Haq to offer our words of gathering. So Tariq, I'll turn it to you now.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings, peace, assalamu alaikum, shalom. I just wanted to, it's an honor here. I'm a third-year student in Masters of Divinity in Islamic Chaplaincy with the Beyond program here at Chicago Theological Seminary. And this program today concerning the weaponization of critical race theory, I'm really looking forward to hearing our speaker. I just wanted to offer some insight. The Quran is the scripture of Muslims. And one of the commands in the Quran is, after saying, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillah, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawmina bil qisti, qawamina bil qisti shuhada lillah. It says, O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice. Stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for God can best protect both. Do not follow your lower desires, lest you swerve, meaning swerving from justice. And if you distort justice or decline to do justice, remember, verily God is well acquainted with all that you do. So we thought this would be an apt thought, because the work of establishing justice is holy work. And it encounters tremendous opposition as over the ages. And today is no different with those who are saying that critical race theory is this and is that and is that and is this. And another verse in the Quran says that the people that create corruption in the earth, when it is said to them, do not create corruption, they say, what? We're not creating corruption. We're the ones that are making peace. But it says, but of a surety, they are the corruptors, but they perceive it not. So we would like to close with a very small chapter of the Quran, a surah called Time Through the Ages. And it says, Wal Asr, Innal insana lafi khusr. Verily by the time, in the passage of time through the ages, surely all of humanity is lost, except those who believe and work righteousness, work good deeds, work goodness, work justice, and enjoin one another in the mutual teaching of truth, and support and enjoin one another in the mutual teachings of truth, and support and enjoin one another in the mutual teachings of patience and perseverance and constancy. So we pray that in this spirit, we will listen and receive the message. And thank you for allowing me to share this reflection. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you very much. I appreciate that so much. And indeed, yes, I feel like these Wednesday gatherings are opportunities for mutual teaching, for truth and support, for finding ways for us together to stand up for justice, to do it collectively, to do it individually. And today's topic is so critical right now in this time when we have seen folks who are weaponizing this idea of, or the concept of critical race theory, and turning it around and using it as a force of destruction and division and racism in our own society. And so I am so delighted to welcome our featured speaker today. Darren Leonard Hutchinson will be with us. Professor Hutchinson is the Emory University School of Law inaugural John Lewis Chair for Civil Rights and Social Justice. He joined the faculty in Emory on July 1st of 2021. Civil rights and social justice are the central foci of his research, teaching, administrative work, and community engagement. He is widely known among local academics and scholars in other fields for the rigor of his work and his sustained commitment to analyzing and remedying inequality. Professor Hutchinson's pioneering research crosses many academic disciplines and looks at the impact of law on a wide range of civil rights and social justice issues. His scholarship emphasizes the importance of viewing inequality as a multidimensional concept. Hutchinson's current research continues to shine light on the complexity of subordination. Professor Hutchinson holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD from Yale Law School. And he'll share a presentation with us and then be joined in conversation by Dr. Christophe Ringer and Reverend Brian Smith. Professor Hutchinson, welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to talk to you today about a very important subject, one that matters a great deal to me due to my professional background and also my interest in civil rights, and that is the subject of critical race theory. Sort of out of nowhere, it seems, recently there have been a lot of discussions of critical race theory in the media, traditional media, on social media, and unfortunately in state legislatures, school boards, and other governmental entities. I have been asked by a lot of people to give comments on this subject, and I think it's vital that people who are interested in social justice not only respond to the criticism of critical race theory, but also to think about it in a broader social context. And my discussion today will focus, kind of narrowly on critical race theory, but I'm going to focus on this broader context that I think will help us understand better what is going on here, and also to craft appropriate responses to what I see as a coordinated effort to discredit anti-racism. So there are a few things I want to accomplish during the, in about 20 minutes that I'll be speaking formally before we get into more of a conversation. And the first thing is just to discuss what critical race theory is, some of the tenets of critical race theory, how it emerged, and some examples of the types of issues that people involved in that research tackle. Then I want to sort of think about the big picture about what's happening here with respect to the critiques of critical race theory. Most of you are familiar with them because they've occupied the headlines for several months now. But I think that just viewing them in and of themselves without thinking of a broader context doesn't really capture the essence of what's going on. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we should go from here as people who are concerned about inequality and social justice. And part of that going forward requires us to look back into history to see how what challenges people faced in the past with respect to social justice and how they overcame those. Because in many ways, we have to pull the same levers today. We pull those levers perhaps in a more creative fashion or more nuanced fashion, but a lot of the resources that come to bear on questions of social justice are things that already exist, and we're just coming to the table as new players. So the first part of my presentation is, what is critical race theory? And so that question has been asked by a lot of people. Surprisingly, I just never expected to think about the subject. So critical race theory, by and large, is an academic discipline. Narrowly, it's a discipline within legal research. Law professors started this idea of critical race theory, and it emerged in the late 1980s as a response to conservative Supreme Court decisions on race. So decisions that limited affirmative action, cases that made it very difficult to prove discrimination by requiring that you show intent and motive when there's a discriminatory outcome, and cases that enlarge the ability of police to get involved in the lives of people, and normally that will be people of color. All right, statistically, police are involved in communities of color, more specifically, poor people of color. So there's just a set of Supreme Court decisions, a lot of it having to do with Reagan winning 2 terms and then Bush, and the appointment of several conservative justices to the Supreme Court gave rise to a lot of decisions that set back civil rights. And so critical race theory comes on the scene, and it had two purposes. And so for those of you who like to go back and research, I'm going to recommend this book. It's Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Formed the Movement. And there is an introduction to that book that really captures, for me, the meaning of critical race theory. I remember reading the book when I was, the year before I became a law professor. And I have just gone back to that chapter so many times just to get focused and to see what was motivating the people back in the late 80s and early 90s who were doing work in critical race theory. And they viewed it as critical race theory as having two purposes. One was to sort of do a progressive intervention into traditional civil rights. All right. And as it was understood at the time, traditional civil rights means that we eradicate laws that discriminate on the basis of race, and we have accomplished equality. All right. So that's the narrative that critical race theory responded to. Critical race theory theorists wanted to say that, well, eradicating laws that discriminate on the basis of race is not exactly equality. That's one form of equality. Let's call that formal equality. So we look to the substance of the law on paper, and it doesn't discriminate on the basis of race. And that's one story of saying that we've eliminated racial discrimination. Critical race theorists are more interested in outcomes. All right, what are the conditions in which people of color live? And by that measure, we haven't achieved racial equality. In fact, there are legal norms that make conditions of inequality or policies that replicate or give rise to conditions of racial inequality. We have doctrines by the courts that make that perfectly legal. All right. So I love teaching this part in constitutional law because it's an eye-opening moment for a lot of students. I always start by asking them when we get to equal protection, how many of you think racial profiling is bad? And but everyone, no one thinks racial profiling is a good thing. And then I say, well, how would you prove that racial profiling exists? What do you need to show that? Well, the court says you need to show intent by the officer to single out someone on the basis of race. How do you do that? It's really hard to do, right? The ticket that they give you doesn't mention race on it, so that they can say, oh yeah, I stopped this person because of race. Instead, you try to use statistical evidence where you look at the conditions of inequality, and the courts do not value that evidence the way critical race theorists believe it should be valued. According to critical race theory, current conditions of inequality are a manifestation of current discrimination and also inherited inequality from the past. All right, and so that message, all right, that simply eradicating race from our laws is not equality. That is a core tenet of critical race theory. Another part of that is that sometimes it might be valuable or advance social justice to think about race, right? So affirmative action, for example, making sure that you have a diverse student body, or to make sure that access to housing is given out in an integrated fashion, to make sure that students in K through 12 attend schools that are not racially isolated, and we take race into account in terms of measuring the success of current policies or the need for change. Critical race theory says that's not a bad thing, right? But if you're thinking of eradication of race as equality, then we have a conflict. All right, so CRT says, we can think about race. Race can actually inform policy. The goal, though, is to eradicate inequality, not to perpetuate inequality. All right, so that was one thing, making this progressive contribution to traditional civil rights. The other piece is that there are these scholars at Harvard Law School, critical legal studies scholars, and they were, very critical of law. The idea is that law is very malleable, law supports the interests of very powerful individuals, that people look towards rights as something that is liberating to them, but rights don't mean anything because it's easy for lawyers and judges to manipulate the doctrine to come up with outcomes that really don't help disadvantaged people. All right, and that was the message of critical legal studies. It wasn't the first time that message appeared in law. There's historical movements where that had occurred before, but critical race theorists came about and said, wait a minute, okay, we agree that law is extraordinarily complicated, but we can't throw away rights altogether, right? The goal here is to make rights meaningful for individuals and to make sure that we enforce them. And for critical race theorists at the time, they viewed that as a racial intervention into progressive scholarship like critical legal studies. Why is that racial? Because to people of color, rights meant a lot historically. All right, rights was an organizing tool for politics. The attainment of rights has been very critical in communities of color throughout U.S. history. And also rights have, even though they're complicated, have transformed society in many ways. All right, so simply tossing aside rights because we are disenchanted with the outcome of law is not the way to go, according to critical race theory. Instead, we have to make rights stronger and continually work to improve how the law treats disadvantaged individuals. So those are the two prongs of critical race theory. It's not, and that work kind of infuses all of the research on that particular subject. All right, the notion that we haven't ended racial discrimination, and racism can exist even when we can't find a person who had the intent for a racist outcome to exist, and that we need to focus on conditions of inequality. Those are all things that are pervasive within critical race theory. I also want to pause here to say this is a huge discipline, and I'm often bothered when people without a background in a field kind of reduce it to like sound bites, right? Especially on questions of race, they just assume that anyone can talk about race. And we have that problem. A lot of people think that they are immunologists today and they know how to prevent disease spread, what's best. So, that's not unique to race in a way, but it is kind of dangerous to assume that we can, without any study, come in and reduce a discipline to a few sound bites and people consume it publicly. And that has been one of the most bothersome things to me about this discussion of critical race theory. You have lawmakers, public officials characterizing an entire body of research, mischaracterizing it, and then feeding it to their constituents for very, very cynical purposes. And so that's just something that, I want you to continue to think of. This is a discipline. I teach courses in critical race theory, 14-week semester. I've been doing this over 20 years and I'm constantly learning new stuff. So it's not something that, kindergartners are getting, and it's not something that can really be reduced to sound bites in the way that it's been done. Another piece of it is that because it's a big discipline, there's going to be some dissent. All right, everyone's not going to think the same way. There are different strands of analysis. Some people are more hopeful, some are more cynical. And so when you see little clips from certain articles being put out there as representing the entire field, you have to question what's going on there. All right, because usually that's selective citation. Not only can they distort what they're citing, which happens a lot, but it could be a more, a minority viewpoint within an entire field that's being promoted as representing the entire field. So that's another thing I want people to be mindful of as they look at the critiques. So the critics say that critical race theory is going around in schools, all right, that's where it is, calling white students oppressors, saying that whites are inherently oppressors, and that there's no value in American principles of democracy and liberal thinking from the Enlightenment, all of those things going on there. Well, you know, I've told you the story about critical race theory, so that's not exactly true. Where does this oppressor thing come from? I think it's probably coming from the notion of discussions of white privilege, that race privileges people and race subordinates individuals. So kind of a distorted response to that is that, you know, you're saying that every white person is an oppressor. Not really a tenet of critical race theory, right? In fact, critical race theory tries to move away from the notion of individual intent to think more about conditions of inequality. So really to just say that the purpose of critical race theory is to label individual people as oppressors is somewhat inconsistent with the goal of critical race theory altogether, which is to move us away from thinking about individuals and more about thinking of systemic racial inequality. All right, so where does this come from? All right, so initially, a lot of people were just responding directly to the critiques, and we have to do that. And I've done that myself just now. But I think it would be a disservice if we didn't think more broadly. And my research and just my knowledge of social movement theory is that there are always counter movements to gains that are accomplished. All right, so there's a back and forth between different movements. And here, critical race theory is part of an anti-racism movement, all right? It's a continuation of the civil rights movement in the same way that Black Lives Matter is a continuation of past anti-racism movements. There's a counter movement, and there have always been counter movements to racial justice throughout history, right? So the civil rights movement was vehemently opposed during the 50s and 60s. Abolition of slavery, that was vehemently opposed at the time. And there's opposition to racial justice movements today. And I think that we need to view this distorted messaging about critical race theory as part of a counter movement to racial justice. And what was the lightning rod for this, I think, was a couple of things. One is the outcome of the election of 2020, and also the Black Lives Matter protests after Floyd's death that really became global in substance and had a lot of people talking about systemic racial inequality and moving away from just discussions of, did I intend to do X, Y, and Z, and instead moving into what can we do about this, right? And so I think those two things combined have led to a backlash. Some of what I'll focus a lot on the election because a lot of people say, why would that create all of this discussion about race? And I think some of the other things are intuitive. So Black Lives Matter being anti-racist, a racist backlash to Black Lives Matter is really, it doesn't need that much explanation. But why the election? Well, I think it has to do with who lost the election, right? And also the demographics of voters who gave Biden his victory in very important states like Nevada and Arizona and Georgia. So you have a lot of liberals, progressive whites, and people of color coalitions creating this victory for Biden. And on the other hand, you have this loss for Trump, who I, describe as, I've described in my research, and I'll do it again today. Trump is a mascot of white supremacy and white nationalism. Why do I use the word mascot rather than symbol? Because of the carnival-like festivals that he would have to sort of rally white supremacists. Throughout his presidency, he would have these large rallies and people were just, cheerleading to President Trump. And he just became this mascot for white nationalism. Substantively, many of the policies he supported came from a place of bias and prejudice. And even if they didn't, they negatively affected communities of color. And studies have shown that people who supported him had very high levels of racial bias, gender bias, and bias with respect to gender identity and sexual orientation. So he was this rallying cry for those folks, and his loss is a loss for white nationalism, right? And so it sparked this counter movement that I have called anti-racism, right? So Trump's loss is seen as a victory for anti-racism. And so this counter movement is opposing that, and it's anti-racism. And there are different components of it. Critical race theory, the attacks on critical race theory are just one component, but I want to piece it together and look at the other components. And I see four. One is just discrediting the election altogether. All right, so if the election represents anti-racism, then we gotta discredit it, right? So how do we discredit it? There is fraud. There is just fraud everywhere, especially in those places where voters were people of color and the election officials were people of color. And so there you got the white nationalist rhetoric going there. The biggest discrediting, or the most violent one, was on January 6th when this band of individuals stormed the U.S. Capitol, endorsed by Trump in order to halt the certification of the election for Biden. All right. So yeah, there's been a lot of efforts to discredit the election, which was viewed as a moment for anti-racism. Another thing beyond that is making it harder to vote in the future for people of color, right? That was an immediate response to the election as well. And we saw several states, just as they've done in the past, if you just look historically at after the Civil War and Reconstruction, during, the pre-civil rights movements, these same states really started passing these laws, making it very difficult or impossible at the time for people of color to vote. Really didn't get large voting by people of color in the southern states until the 1965 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So another maneuver, stop the voting. And that has been a critical move in a lot of states. Another one is to stigmatize protests, anti-racist protests, or make it very difficult to protest. We saw the National Guard disperse, the military dispersed on anti-racist protesters. Even before the election, states were passing laws that are considering laws that would immunize people who drove their vehicles into folks in the road protesting, right? If you're present in the road without a permit, then and you were hit by a car, that person could not be liable. Right? So under traditional law, you can be. Just because someone's in the road doesn't mean you have a license to hit them under any circumstance. All right, but these laws are trying to undo, basic negligence or intentional tort law. And the driving force behind that has been the Black Lives Matter protests, which often take to the streets like other protests have throughout history. Another thing that's happened since the election, our states are passing laws reclassifying protests as riots. And that's a rhetorical move on some level, but the legal implications of this in the legislation that I've seen is that it would give police greater authority to interfere in the protests, right? So once it's classified as a riot rather than some type of gathering, that can trigger a more hostile or aggressive response from police. So we've seen that happening in the same states where we've seen the discrediting of the election, and the efforts to make it more difficult to vote. And then the final piece is the critical race theory piece. Let's discredit the intellectual basis for this movement, all right? The intellectual basis for anti-racism, the notion that we haven't eradicated racial discrimination, that we need to look at conditions of inequality, that if you examine the lives of people of color today, there's a lot of suffering, and our laws and culture legitimize that. All right, so that's basically critical race theory in a nutshell. Let's discredit that notion. We're calling it critical race theory, but it could apply to any person or group of people who have that thought about the conditions of race today. For example, the Florida policy banning critical race theory in schools says that teachers literally cannot teach the notion of, quote, that's why I'm saying literally, systemic racism. You can only teach that racism is a product of individual bias. So what does that do? It means there's nothing wrong with conditions of inequality. And that's the message that they want conveyed to children today. Not only, white children, but also children of color, right? That if you're living in conditions of inequality, it must be your fault or your parents' fault. It's not because there's been a deficit in our society, but a failure to respond to these conditions. All right, and so those are what I think evidence that it's more than just critical race theory. This is a broader thing. Moving into the next section about going forward, I think we have to look historically first. And history informs a lot of my analysis here. As I was sitting down trying to figure out what is going on, why are they talking about critical race theory, I just thought back to history and said, you know what? All of these things, these four things I just said, have been part of backlash to every advancement in racial justice throughout history. So if we start with abolition, you discredit the intellectual basis for abolition, that people are actually equal, that biological racism is wrong, it's a fraud, that spiritually there's it's inconsistent with Christian notions of theology that existed at the time. All right, so let's discredit that, and there's a lot of effort to do that. Stigmatized protests. One of the things that is so interesting to me is the President Jackson and the U.S. Postal Service started refusing to distribute abolitionist literature in Southern states. All right, states where slavery was. That was part of the movement. We didn't have Twitter and all of that stuff then, so a lot of communication was by mail. And how do you silence organizing around this? Let's just don't distribute the literature. So when these abolitionist societies tried to send things to Southern states, or to even in Northern states, just to drum up opposition to slavery, there was an effort to ban that from happening. The issue of voting doesn't require that much attention. Grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, all of that stuff throughout history, absolute outright violence from private individuals without any police protection whatsoever. Those have been mechanisms throughout history as a response to anti-racism. And also just discrediting all types of movements for progressive change. We've seen that throughout history, but here we are, we're still fighting. And that's just where I want to close. We have to do the same things that we've always been doing. We have to do it in a more creative fashion, but in many ways, organizing, right? Litigation, political strategies in terms of getting people, like-minded individuals elected, nonprofits providing services to individuals who are indigent. All of these things are absolutely extraordinarily important. But one thing that just really has happened, and if you look back, it's been part of all struggle across history. We have to continue speaking truth to power. I mean, and it sounds like a cliche in some respect, but it's extraordinarily important to have events like this. I have seen people who are liberals saying, let's just join them in bashing critical race theory so we can move on to something else. That's not speaking truth to power, that's acquiescing. And so I just think that, even though it sounds like, we've heard speak truth to power before, it needs to be reiterated. People have to sort of become reinvigorated in terms of struggle. And I just want to close two things I want to close with. Well, it's one thing, but two people embody it. As you debate people about critical race theory or have these discussions beyond today, I just want you to think about two things. One, two people, Dr. King and John Lewis. Why do I bring them up? Well, they actually embodied some of the messages of critical race theory in their own advocacy. All right. And so Dr. King, for example, said that simply changing the laws is not enough, and not when you still have racialized poverty. I'm going to just look momentarily at this quote. He said, and he goes back to slavery. In 1863, the Negro was granted freedom from physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation, but he was not given land to make that freedom meaningful. All right, there we go. Just saying slavery is over isn't enough. Just saying we're not going to discriminate on the basis isn't enough. We need to have some substantive equality, and that's what he was focusing on. He talked about that with respect to the movement that he led in the 60s as well, that we have to focus on class inequality as well. And that is a strong message of critical race theory. And the other thing that I want to respond to, because one of the biggest critiques of critical race theory that I've seen is this notion that they want to say that things are still bad and then that we still have to fight, and racism is a thing of the past. And that's where John Lewis comes in. And I do this because, at Emory, I'm the John Lewis Chair in Civil Rights and Social Justice. I'm the first newly created position. And there's a symposium from the Journal of Law and Religion at Emory that's coming out early next year, and I was asked to contribute. And this essay, I think this quote from John Lewis that I put in the essay, I think it is critical race theory. It is the notion that we have to continue fighting and that we haven't reached it yet. And just indulge me a moment. I'm going to pull it up and read it to you. So, and John Lewis, this is in a book called Across That Bridge. And this part of the book, he was really speaking to young people who are so upset and disenchanted that we have to continue fighting for these things. And here's what he says. Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair, more just society. The work of love, peace, and justice will always be necessary until their realism and their imperative takes hold of our imagination, crowds out any dreams of hatred or revenge, and fills up our existence with their power. All right, and that to me is a statement that we have to continue fighting. We have not reached a promised land. I mean, those words were 4 years ago from John Lewis. And so I encourage you to use those quotes, because there are people who criticize critical race theory who would not criticize John Lewis and Dr. King. They would say, why can't critical race theorists be like John Lewis or Dr. King? And I want you to say they are. That's what I want your reaction to be in the future. They are, and feed those quotes to them. And so I'm going to close there. I could go on and on and on and on. Like I said, 14 weeks in a semester, but I definitely want to get to the conversational piece. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Hutchinson. Thank you for that comprehensive review of what is a 14-week course for law students, and you've done a marvelous job summarizing it for us in a half an hour. So we do appreciate you. And very quickly, I just want to move forward as we begin the conversation. And you've given a number of prevailing themes, making legal rights meaningful and making progressive contributions to the civil rights movement. And I might add, it sounds like a critique and analysis of legalized injustice. And so as we move forward in the conversation, I'm going to ask Dr. Ringer to kind of talk to us from a point of theological ethics as we begin talking about what this weaponization is really about.
Well, good morning to CTS community. Good afternoon, excuse me. Thank you, Professor Hutchinson, for that wonderful overview regarding what critical race theory is and what it isn't. And I just want to say just some brief thoughts, and then to also ask you some questions as well. I think it's important, as you mentioned, to see the weaponization of critical race theory in this larger political context. In particular, the mobilization of school boards, because public schools have always been this huge source of political struggle, because public schools historically have been about standardizing American culture, right? And they've been a kind of a battleground for who we are going to be as a nation. And so could you say a little bit about the threat we're facing in terms of the capture of the rule of law by a vision of white nationalism?
Right. So I think the school issue is very important. And I think when you put it into the framework of this counter movement is fighting for what they see as rapid demographic change that's not in their favor. All right. So what they need to capture the younger generation in a way. And how can you do that? Just by changing what younger people are exposed to. All right. So it's like winning the battle in a place that is very legitimate for folks. Like going to school is just a part of life in the United States, right? And so what you learn in school is right. And that's the message that students have all the time. And so if you can control that message, right? Not only that they're not teaching critical race theory, but they're not teaching systemic racism. And some of those laws actually include, things about gender inequality. So it's even beyond that. If you can reach these younger folks, then you have spread the ideological basis for your movement to a next generation that you desperately need, because your ideology is becoming outmoded. And so I think it's a cornerstone of this movement based on the changing demographics in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So if I could follow up on that point regarding public schools, I appreciate you sharing kind of the broad context of how scholars and activists have really been thinking about social inequality in the wake of the civil rights movement, focusing on conditions and not just personal intent. And prior to the controversies regarding critical race theory, for at least a decade now, we've seen charter schools be a source of controversy and an engine for resegregation. And as a consequence, the kind of money that's flowing into school board races is extraordinary. So these are really kind of hotbed kind of political races. And could you say a little bit about how this weaponization of critical race theory also impacts this ongoing kind of demise of public education as a public good?
Right. I mean, I think the interesting thing is you'll probably see in the next round of school board elections, people saying, you know, I oppose critical race theory in schools. So they're gonna, and just to the extent that those elections have already occurred, I suspect that that issue has come up. But I imagine that's going to be an issue in those elections. But it'll also, remember, it's not just critical race theory. I think you'll see platforms designed to counter, you know, egalitarian goals. And one example I have, it's a little dated now, but it was Wake County in North Carolina when Obama won in 2008, that ushered in this really progressive school board that adopted policies to integrate schools by class. Right? They were trying to deal with conservative Supreme Court doctrine, which said you can't use race. So they did it by class, which kind of effectively integrated by race as well. And this is based on research showing that even the poorest students of color do better in schools that are integrated by race and or class. All right. Skip forward 4 years, the Tea Party wins and they get rid of that policy, right? It wasn't a race policy. And what did they call it? Social engineering, right? And so, yeah, I think you're going to see these battles come up. Schools are a place, I've always historically been a battle because education is to some extent empowering in our society. And so to the extent that you can have educational inequality in segregated schools, and more money going into charter schools or other or private schools and away from public schools, that's a way of maintaining inequality. Or just to have a complete drastic inequality between public schools. So schools that are wealthier, suburban school districts versus very rural or inner city school districts where students of color are disproportionately located. That's another issue. So even without bringing the charter schools in, you have drastic inequalities and public schools, and that's something that conservatives and conservative doctrine by the Supreme Court endorses. There was a case called San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, where the Supreme Court held that those drastic financial differences don't violate the Equal Protection Clause. And so that's given schools, states and districts a license to engage in that type of discrimination. So it's always has been and will continue to be part of a battle over social justice.
And can you, I know we have some questions in the chat. I'm sorry, Reverend Smith, did you want to?
Yes, I was just going to pivot us towards the chat room because there's a question that ties in with this whole idea of using CRT as a dog whistle so that any measure that is anti-racist becomes CRT. And KC says, sensitivity trainings are often put under the umbrella of CRT. It seems to me that these HR types of interventions into racism are hyper-focused on individual intent. So I suppose that CRT would be the wrong category. But then they go on to say, regardless of the category, do you or would real CRT have any critiques or insights regarding these, albeit mischaracterized, current liberal interventions in racism?
All right. I mean, that's a very interesting question. So Cheryl Harris is this professor at UCLA Law School who teaches critical race theory. And, you know, her work on this is, I guess, the most involved in terms of sensitivity training. She hates it. I mean, she wrote an op-ed diversity training. All right. And why? Because it doesn't deal with systemic wrong. It's like, it's just telling everybody to treat each other nicely, but it doesn't address any of the agenda of the organization itself. And so that is one version of critical race theory. There are other people who endorse these types of things because there's research which shows that having a diversified workforce can change the agenda of the institutions. And I would say that that can, it just depends on who's there, right? But there's some room for optimism with respect to that. How does it get wrapped up in critical race theory? I think because some of the training you may see language like white privilege or research regarding implicit bias, and all of that stuff is just in many ways things that a conservative movement does not like to hear that stuff, because it's an indication that bias exists even when you're not conscious of it, or that there's still inequality even when I am not intending to create inequality. That goes against the status quo in a very profound way. And so wrapping that up with CRT is a great way of just, bashing the entire enterprise of diversity and anti-racism. Personally, we work in these environments, and so working in an institution, individual treatment kind of is more heightened. It matters a little bit more. So I think there's room for it. The question is, how is it done, and does it shift the overall agenda of the institution? All right. So just bringing in diversity, but your policies remain the same, isn't going to help anything. And I think the place where we can see that the most is diversifying police forces doesn't get rid of racial profiling, doesn't get rid of mass incarceration. So we need something more than that.
Go ahead, Dr. Ringer.
Can you, I see we have a couple more questions in the chat, but I wanted to know if you could briefly comment on, here I'm thinking about the Southern Baptist Convention, which initially had an uproar over critical race theory, but it also included intersectionality. So could you talk about the ways in which CRT is this umbrella in which a lot of different groups are threatened, and different ideas are threatened as well?
Right. So one of the things that critical race theory has done, and my research actually is part of this particular field, is that, oppression or discrimination exists in bundles. It's not just, you can't just look at racism without thinking about sex or gender or sexual orientation or poverty. And that, that's what I call multidimensionality, that there are just so many other things that we have to bring and to focus. And so, intersectionality, which is more associated with race and sex discrimination, to people who oppose racism and feminism, that's going to be a lightning rod. You got two things going for you in that moment. So I would certainly not surprised that people who, are prejudiced or subscribe to ideologies that replicate inequality, intersectionality would be a huge threat to them. And that's a piece of critical race theory as well. So absolutely. But at the same time, it's extraordinarily important to focus on these things. And just because people will react with hostility should not mean that we don't focus on them. In fact, it probably means that we should, right? I often judge my research based on how people who oppose my general agenda respond to it. If they all, my goal isn't always to get people to agree with me, it's to shake them up and make them think. So absolutely, and I think that's how the intersectional scholars would respond, like Kim Crenshaw.
I want to lift up another intersection, especially as we draw to a close, but given the fact that we are a space that convenes faith leaders, of course, Dr. Ringer, we've seen similar patterns in the response to liberation theology. And so I want to ask both of you to respond to this. How do you respond to those who pit critical race theory against faith?
I've actually seen, there's a recent article on, I can't remember the exact title of it, which suggested that the intersectionality, multidimensionality folks would not embrace a faith agenda. That's interesting, but actually, what I'd like to say is that, and I thought about this for this moment because of the audience, there are earlier writings in critical race theory that link it to liberation theology and the messages and things in there, and in particular, the vision of equality preached by Dr. King. So there's this author I'll give to you, Anthony Cook. He's a professor at Georgetown, was one of the earlier writers in critical race theory that linked religion and critical race theory. And so I think it's important to think about that. After Trump first won the election, I listened to Barber and other ministers who were really powerful and had those messages. And he said, think about Reconstruction. This really stands to me today. Imagine walking off of a plantation. This is my language, but he kind of gave me the idea. Imagine walking off a plantation into convict leasing. Like, if they can deal with that type of backlash, wow. All right, so our lives look a lot easier. So yeah, like I said, we have a lot of levers to push, and if faith folks are out there pushing egalitarianism, they are my allies and friends as well.
Thank you. This is such a rich discussion. I'm sure we could go another 45 minutes, but I know that we are nearing the end of our time. And so I will turn the session back over to Lisa Zook.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Professor Hutchinson. Thank you, Dr. Ringer. Thank you, those who participated in the chat. Brian, you are absolutely right. We could easily go another 45 minutes or all afternoon. But it's a critical topic, and I appreciate it. And I want to go back to our friend Tariq's words at the beginning in this conversation, helping us all to stand up for justice in this time of sort of mutual teaching. So I know that I have some takeaways. I hope others do too. I trust that others do too. And Professor Hutchinson, this is your first time with us at CTS, and I hope it's not your last time with us. So we would love to stay in touch, and we have a shared passion for creating justice in this world. So it's good to know you and good to have you here with us today.